April 15th, 1945, 15:30 hours, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Lower Saxony, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin of the 11th British Armoured Division stood at the gates of Bergen-Belsen and tried to comprehend what he was seeing. His unit had fought through France and into Germany, had seen combat's worst horrors, had witnessed death in forms that should have numbed him to further shock. Nothing had prepared him for this. The camp stretched before him in organized rows, wooden barracks, watchtowers, barbed wire perimeter. But the organization was surface illusion, masking chaos underneath. Bodies lay everywhere, not scattered from recent combat, but stacked, piled, lying where people had fallen and been left. Thousands of them. The living moved among the dead, with movements so slow and listless they were barely distinguishable from corpses. The smell, decay, excrement, disease, was overwhelming even from outside the wire. A woman approached the gate, her movement more falling forward than walking. She was skeletal, her face all angles and hollow spaces where flesh should have been. Her striped camp uniform hung on her frame like cloth draped over sticks. She reached the wire and stopped, staring at Gonin and his men with eyes that seemed unable to process what they were seeing. "Are you real?" she asked in German, her voice barely audible. "Or are we dead already?" Gonin had no answer that made sense. He ordered the gates opened and medical personnel forward. Then he began the hardest work of his military career, trying to save people who'd been systematically destroyed, trying to restore humanity to a place specifically designed to eliminate it. The approach. The 11th Armored Division's arrival at Bergen-Belsen came through accident of military geography rather than specific liberation mission. British forces advancing through northern Germany in early April 1945 encountered retreating German units and isolated resistance points, but nothing resembling organized defense. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, its coherence shattered, individual units either surrendering or fleeing eastward ahead of Allied advance. On April 12th, British intelligence received information about a concentration camp near the village of Bergen, potentially holding large numbers of prisoners who would require humanitarian assistance. The camp wasn't military objective. It held no strategic value, posed no tactical threat. But British command recognized humanitarian obligation to secure the facility and provide assistance to prisoners. The 11th Armored Division, being closest to the location, received orders to approach and take control of the camp from German authorities. What happened next was unusual in military operations. German camp commandant Josef Kramer, recognizing that fighting would serve no purpose and might spread disease from the camp into surrounding area, negotiated brief truce with approaching British forces. On April 12th, an agreement was reached. German forces would withdraw from the immediate area. British forces would assume control of the camp, and Kramer and his SS personnel would remain to facilitate transition and provide information about camp conditions. The arrangement reflected German desperation. Kramer and his subordinates knew what they'd done, and that discovery meant death sentences. But they also knew that fleeing would only delay that outcome while potentially spreading typhus epidemic that was raging through the camp. Better to hand over responsibility and hope for mercy than to abandon the camp and face certain execution later. British forces approached on April 15th with no clear understanding of what they would find. Intelligence reports indicated a concentration camp holding political prisoners and POWs, overcrowded and experiencing disease outbreak. That description, while technically accurate, failed completely to convey the reality of Bergen-Belsen in April 1945. What they found. Bergen-Belsen had been established in 1940 as prisoner of war camp, later converted to concentration camp, holding various categories of prisoners the Nazi regime deemed enemies or undesirables. By early 1945, as Germany collapsed and Soviet forces advanced from the east, Bergen-Belsen became dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps in Poland and eastern Germany. Designed to hold perhaps 10,000 prisoners, it now contained over 60,000, with absolutely inadequate facilities for that population. The result was catastrophe that unfolded over months. Food supplies were minimal and irregular. Sanitation facilities were overwhelmed. Disease spread unchecked through overcrowded barracks. German authorities had essentially abandoned administrative functions, leaving prisoners to survive or die with minimal intervention. By April 1945, Bergen-Belsen had ceased functioning as concentration camp and become simply a place where people died in enormous numbers. When British forces entered on April 15th, they found approximately 60,000 prisoners still alive and perhaps 10,000 unburied corpses. The statistics couldn't capture the human reality. The living prisoners were in conditions that defied description. Starved to near death, many too weak to move, most suffering from typhus or dysentery, many so far gone that survival was impossible regardless of medical intervention. The corpses lay everywhere, stacked outside barracks where they'd been dragged by prisoners too weak to carry them further, lying in open areas where people had collapsed and died, piled in mass graves partially covered with dirt. The German SS, recognizing they couldn't manage the death rate through normal burial, had simply given up. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be processed, even using prison labor. British soldiers entering the camp experienced immediate visceral shock. These were men hardened by years of combat, who'd seen friends killed and cities destroyed, who thought they understood war's horrors. Bergen-Belsen exceeded anything they'd experienced or imagined. The scale of death, the condition of survivors, the evidence of systematic destruction of human beings, it was beyond comprehension for people whose frame of reference included rules and limits even in war. Captain Derek Sington, arriving shortly after initial entry, later wrote, "I had tried to visualize the interior of a concentration camp, but I had not imagined it like this, nor had I imagined the strange dead silence that hung over the place. Corpses in every state of decay were lying around, piled up on top of each other in heaps. Some were in huts, others were outside, in the gutters, in the compound, by the wire. Everywhere was death." The response British forces faced situation that military training hadn't prepared them for, not combat, but humanitarian catastrophe requiring immediate action with inadequate resources. The first priority was establishing control and preventing further deaths. Guards were posted to secure perimeter and prevent prisoners from wandering into surrounding area where they might spread disease. German SS personnel were detained. Most would later be charged with war crimes. Medical personnel began triaging prisoners, identifying those requiring immediate treatment, and attempting to assess scale of medical emergency. The assessment was grim. Of approximately 60,000 prisoners found alive, perhaps 28,000 were so weakened by starvation and disease that they would die regardless of medical intervention. Another 20,000 were seriously ill but might survive with proper treatment. The remaining prisoners were in better condition but still required significant medical care and feeding. The medical challenges were unprecedented. Simply feeding starved prisoners was dangerous. Their digestive systems had shut down, and introducing food too quickly could kill them through refeeding syndrome. British medical officers implemented careful protocol. small portions of light food at regular intervals, gradually increasing as prisoners' systems adapted. Even with careful management, many prisoners died after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. Typhus presented separate crisis. The disease was epidemic in the camp, spread by lice that infested every structure and every prisoner. Controlling the outbreak required delousing every prisoner, destroying contaminated clothing, and burning infested barracks. British forces set up delousing stations where prisoners were washed, their heads shaved, their old clothing destroyed, and new clothing provided. The process was necessary but traumatic for prisoners who'd been subjected to similar procedures as part of Nazi dehumanization. Lieutenant Colonel Gonin, who'd commanded relief operations, later described the operation. The relief of a concentration camp is not anything that can be described. The dead and the living lay together. Those who could move crawled to the water, and those who couldn't lay and waited until someone came to them. On the first day, we had only 2 water cans for 60,000 people. British military medical services were quickly overwhelmed by scale of need. Appeals went out for additional medical personnel, supplies, and equipment. Medical students from London hospitals volunteered and were flown to Germany to assist. The British Red Cross and other organizations mobilized resources. Within days, Bergen-Belsen had been transformed from concentration camp into massive field hospital, though one struggling desperately against impossible conditions. The prisoners' experience. For prisoners who'd survived Bergen-Belsen's final months, liberation came as experience so unexpected they struggled to process it. Rachel Genuth had been imprisoned at Belsen since evacuation from Auschwitz in January 1945. She was 17 years old, weighed perhaps 70 pounds, suffered from typhus that would have killed her within days or weeks. When British soldiers entered her barracks, she was lying on wooden boards that served as bunk, too weak to move, barely conscious. She remembered a soldier kneeling beside her, speaking words she couldn't understand because she'd forgotten most of her German and didn't speak English. His tone was gentle, concerned. He offered water from his canteen. She drank, the water almost painful in her throat, but wonderful. He covered her with his jacket because she was shivering despite the April warmth. Then he left, and she lay there wondering if she'd hallucinated the encounter. But he returned with others, medical personnel who examined her, who tried to explain in broken German that they would help her, who lifted her carefully and carried her to an ambulance that took her to hospital being established in former German military barracks nearby. There, she received treatment that would save her life. Careful refeeding, medication for typhus, basic nursing care that addressed infections and wounds that had been untreated for months. The experience of liberation varied depending on prisoners' conditions and where they were in the camp. Some prisoners, hearing that British forces had arrived, managed to reach the gates where they encountered soldiers who were visibly shocked by what they were seeing. Others, too weak to move, waited in barracks until medical personnel reached them. A few, disbelieving that liberation was real, hid or tried to escape, convinced this was Nazi trick or that British would simply execute them. Many prisoners couldn't emotionally process liberation immediately. They'd survived by shutting down emotionally, by existing moment to moment without hope or expectation beyond immediate survival. Liberation required reopening to possibilities they'd abandoned, that they might survive, that someone cared about their fate, that the horror might actually end. That reopening was sometimes too much to bear immediately. Hannah Levy-Haas, Belgian Jew imprisoned at Belsen, wrote in diary, "We cannot believe we are finally free. We expected death, prepared for it, accepted it. Now they tell us we'll live. But how can we believe? We've been told too many lies. The moral weight. British soldiers and medical personnel working at Bergen-Belsen carried psychological burden that would affect them for the remainder of their lives. These weren't people who'd chosen to work in concentration camps or who'd been prepared for what they would encounter. They were military personnel and medical staff who found themselves confronting evidence of systematic mass murder on scale that exceeded anything they'd imagined possible. The work they did, treating the dying, burying the dead, trying to restore humanity to survivors, was necessary but traumatic. Many developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. They had nightmares about what they'd seen. They struggled with guilt about not being able to save everyone, about actions they'd taken or failed to take. They carried anger at what had been done to prisoners, at the German personnel who'd perpetrated it, at world that had allowed it to happen. Lieutenant Colonel Gonin wrote years later, "I can give no adequate description of the horror camp in which my men and myself were to spend the next month of our lives. It was so horrible that I had to persuade myself that what I saw was real and not just a nightmare." Medical personnel faced particular moral distress. Doctors and nurses trained to save lives found themselves making triage decisions about who would receive limited resources, knowing that many would die regardless of treatment provided. They worked in conditions of overwhelming need with inadequate supplies, watching people die whom they might have saved with more resources. The helplessness was profound, but they continued working. British forces devoted enormous resources to Bergen-Belsen's relief, resources that might have been used elsewhere for military purposes. Soldiers who should have been advancing against German forces instead spent weeks burying bodies and helping survivors. Medical personnel worked until exhaustion and then continued working. The commitment wasn't ordered or compelled. It came from recognition that this was what had to be done, that walking away was unthinkable regardless of cost. The systematic response. As scope of disaster became clear, British authorities implemented comprehensive response that transformed Bergen-Belsen from death camp to recovery facility. The initial chaos of April 15th gave way to organized relief operation within days. British military medical services established command structure coordinating medical care, sanitation, food distribution, and all other aspects of operating massive humanitarian mission. The nearby town of Bergen was requisitioned. German civilians were ordered out of their homes, which were then used to house recovering prisoners and medical facilities. The German population's forced displacement was deliberate policy. British authorities insisted that German civilians witness what had been done in their vicinity, that they participate in burial of victims, that they confront evidence of Nazi regime's crimes directly. Local residents were marched through the camp, made to see the corpses and survivors, required to assist in burial details. The policy was punitive, but also educational. Germans who claimed ignorance of concentration camps could no longer maintain that position when forced to bury camp victims. Burial of the dead was a massive undertaking. 10,000 corpses couldn't be buried individually with any appropriate ceremony. British forces used bulldozers to dig mass graves, then buried bodies in groups while chaplains conducted brief services. The work was grim and necessary, driven by public health requirements as much as respect for dead. Decomposing bodies in spring warmth presented disease hazard that required immediate action. The camp's infrastructure was gradually dismantled. Infested barracks were burned to eliminate typhus vectors. Surviving prisoners were moved to better facilities as quickly as their health permitted. Within months, Bergen-Belsen had been transformed from concentration camp to displaced persons camp, where survivors could recover before attempting to rebuild their lives. The gradual recovery for survivors. Liberation was beginning of long process, rather than immediate salvation. Rachel Jeneth spent 3 months in British military hospital, recovering from typhus and malnutrition. Her treatment was careful and professional. Doctors and nurses who monitored her progress, adjusted her diet as her system recovered, treated infections and complications. But recovery wasn't just physical. She'd survived trauma that had destroyed her family, her community, her entire previous life. Physical healing was necessary, but insufficient foundation for returning to meaningful existence. British authorities established displaced persons system to help survivors navigate their situations. Most had no homes to return to. Their cities were destroyed or now under Soviet control, their families murdered, their property seized. They needed documentation, assistance finding relatives who might have survived, help determining where they could go and how they could rebuild lives. Some survivors eventually emigrated to Palestine, to America, to Britain itself. Others remained in Germany, unable or unwilling to leave. Many spent years in displaced persons camps, existing in limbo between destroyed past and uncertain future. The liberation saved their lives, but couldn't restore what had been taken from them. Years later, survivors would speak about British liberation with complicated emotions. Gratitude for being saved, certainly, but also grief for those who died despite liberation, anger at world that had permitted the camps to exist, sorrow for lives that could never be fully recovered. Liberation was necessary and insufficient. Necessary to survive, but insufficient to heal what had been broken. The legacy that wasn't Bergen-Belsen's liberation by British forces demonstrated both capacity for humanitarian response and profound failure that made such response necessary. British soldiers and medical personnel who worked at Bergen-Belsen performed admirably under impossible circumstances, saving thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost. Their commitment, professionalism, and basic human decency in confronting unprecedented horror deserves recognition and respect. They did what needed to be done when doing nothing would have been easier and more comfortable. But their heroism couldn't erase fundamental reality. Bergen-Belsen existed because civilized nations had failed to prevent Nazi Germany's crimes. The camp had operated for years, killing tens of thousands, while Allied governments knew concentration camps existed but prioritized military objectives over rescue operations. Liberation in April 1945 saved survivors but couldn't help the hundreds of thousands who'd already died. The lesson wasn't that British liberation was heroic, though individuals certainly acted heroically. The lesson was that such liberation should never have been necessary, that concentration camps should have been prevented or stopped years earlier, that societies must intervene against systematic mass murder rather than waiting for military victory to create opportunity for humanitarian response. For survivors, British liberation meant life rather than death, hope rather than despair, acknowledgement of their humanity after years of systematic dehumanization. But it couldn't restore their families, their communities, their previous lives. It couldn't undo the trauma or heal the psychological wounds. It could only stop the dying and provide foundation for survivors to rebuild what they could from the wreckage. Lieutenant Colonel Gonin perhaps captured the essential truth when he wrote, "We came to save lives, and we saved some, but so many we could not save, and that failure weighs on us still. We did our duty, but our duty came too late for most." That is something we carry forward, a reminder that preventing such horrors matters more than relieving them after the fact.